Are we ready to go?
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, so anyone who's sort of seen me present before, I usually am a bit experimental. I tend to like to sort of make games as part of my presentation or use interaction from the crowd. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do today, I got a little bit stuck because I wanted to present my PhD research, but my PhD research kind of takes a number of different tracks. So rather than actually presenting the games themselves, which I'm making, or indeed the sort of images of the making process, I thought that instead I would show you some of the code snippets. Not just the code snippets actually, but the code comments between myself and my collaborators, which will give you a bit of an indication as to not only the good side of development for archaeology, but also the more interpersonal and comedic side. So in that vein, as we progress into the slide, the stuff on the far left-hand side will be those comments, and the stuff on the right-hand side will be my very dubious quality drawings. So this is me. I am Tara. And this quote was from one of my collaborators who consistently wrote throughout my coding, who wrote this abomination. So indeed, it's a relevant question to ask today about who wrote this presentation. So to say, I'm Tara. I'm a PhD student between the University of Aarhus and the University of York. And my research kind of crosses into two separate areas. I work a lot with game development and design and computing, as well as with archaeology, but we'll get into that in more detail later. My research is funded by the CDH, so huge shout out to them, thank you. You should consider going and looking at what they do as well. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at GamingArcheo, not Archeo Gaming, although I also recommend following him. So this is a pretty common quote for anyone who deals with coding collaboratively, which is comes with a lot of my work actually. So this one actually came from something which I'm still to this day not entirely sure how it's compiled, but it magically works, so we're not going to question it too hard. Hopefully the talk will have a bit more structure to it and we'll actually understand what happens in the end. So in that light, the talk itself will focus around what is my research and how it works. Specifically focusing around my master's project and also my PhD. The PhD itself, the master's, we sold that's early on the timeline. The master's focused on how game developers, archaeologists, and players of games interacted, and how they kind of understood archaeology, how they understood development, how they understood the interaction of all these things. And as part of this, I went out and did placements at game studios, I did research with game studios, and I developed games. My PhD research at the moment is focused much more around the development of them, and specifically not about how we can develop games for people to consume, but how developing games as an archaeologist can help us to think about archaeology. We'll get into that more later. So at the far left-hand side of the scale, in the archaeogaming scale, we had the talks by Andrea and the awesome Dwarf Fortress guys yesterday. So the application of archaeology to existing games. A little bit further over, we had the awesome talk by John about excavating existing code and kind of applying what to us seems to be a very archaeological process by excavating through these layers to look at how these games operate and why. And I thought this was another good quote to exemplify that it works pretty well and was a very interesting talk. A little bit further over, we had the development stuff. The people from Wispfire, the people like Marta who are developing games and sort of presenting those to us. And this quote, again, comes up a lot in our work where stuff is not quite sure why it works, but if you delete it, then it sort of everything falls apart, and it is very important to how the code operates. And so this, to me, seemed a very good way to explain that without these people who are actually making games for archaeologists to analyze and to engage with, a lot of what we do would fall apart. A little bit further over was the stuff which Eric and Marta presented about kind of mechanics and frameworks for development, and the kind of analysis and rhetoric which goes along with that, thinking about how archaeology and games interrelate and how we should go about sort of understanding these. And they are really important, so we probably shouldn't touch those. And my master's research fits into this section. So to the right of that, we now have my PhD research, which is looking into how, well, it's not so concerned with making commercially viable games, or even really in the end product of the game itself to any large extent. It's mostly concerned with how creating games, the actual creative process, could be used for us to understand the process. So there's a bit of reworking here as to how that might operate that we need to go back into. But the question that I get asked a lot as part of this is why should we do this? That kind of seems, you know, a bit irrelevant potentially. And to kind of defend this, it's not just some weird experiment. It's not just some academic junk which will go on to be deleted in the future. It's something which, as archaeologists, we deal with media all the time, and we deal with creative practice. And actually thinking about how that media operates, how we create, how we operate, is a really big deal. And games have some really interesting stuff to offer us. So to kind of understand this, we need to go back to Ian Hodder back in 1990. So back in 1990, Ian Hodder made a call for archaeologists to become reflexive and creative and to experiment with archaeology. Basically, in plain English, what Hodder identified was that for archaeology to make sense of itself and for it to grow, we needed to be mindful of how we were operating, how we were creating, and what we were creating through. Basically because the media which we use influences how we can communicate that. So to step back a little bit further in time to Marshall McLuhan, a proclaimed media expert, who said that the media is the message, which basically means that the media forms we use to structure our knowledge in archaeology or in the world in general, structures how we can think about, how we can communicate, how we can indeed understand these topics. So for example, writing with a pen and paper has a certain physicality to it which constrains what you can actually communicate, what you can say, what you can think about, what you can do with it. You know, you can write scripts in paper, but you can't make the movie on paper. That requires a different media form. Same with games. There are things which games do which are not really possible in other media forms. So video games, obviously, type of media, they structure our communications in certain ways. So at the kind of very far end of this spectrum, McLuhan believed that media forms really actually influence not only how we can communicate, but how we can also interpret and how we can think about our topics. So if this holds true, and I believe it does, potentially video games will give us an interesting way to perceive the past. So media forms, this is a joke we'll get to later. Media forms basically have two sets of things. There's an internal affordance and an external affordance. Internal affordances are something which are inherent to the medium, the physicality of it, whereas things like external affordances are things which are brought in by external discipline. So, for example, an internal media affordance of working with a game, specifically designing through Unity, would be the type of language that you use to program in. So for anyone who's familiar with Unity scripting, there's kind of like C#, JavaScript, and there's Boo. And a running joke from our development team is that it would probably work better in Boo, and it never does. So, with regards to external affordances, this is another common thing in my writing. External affordances are all the kind of baggage that we put onto a media form which aren't inherent to its properties. So it's things like if we were to create a game, but we wrote it just purely in text. We use a game engine, but we don't make a game with it. You're basically applying external affordances onto a medium to confine what you're trying to talk about. This is actually something that we do a lot in archaeology, or actually in academic publication as well. So there's this real tendency, especially with like online publication, that there's this great miscellany of things that we can do, but we tend to kind of continuously shove our traditional and institutional bound rhetorics onto that, which formalizes how we can communicate regardless of what media forms we're using. So if we go back to Hodder, who identified that archaeology with certain media forms in certain ways tends to confine how we can think about the past, and that potentially that experimentation was vital. So yes, another comment which comes up quite a lot, which is this really how we choose to do this, or how I chose to do this in this case? With regards to archaeology, is the media forms that we're using, are they actually serving what we want to do effectively, or is there other ways that we could basically think about our discipline? So, sort of following on from Hodder, sort of swathes of people took up this call. So there was a guy called Swalker who used comics to think through the Copplestone excavations. Watterson has been doing some fantastic work with 3D reconstruction and using sort of like a critical and reflexive process to think about how 3D modeling, how the use of LiDAR and scanning data can interpolate into that. There's a vast wealth of people who are working with this. Now, these are the kind of people who are not just using these media forms for fun, like they're not doing it to be down with the kids or because comic books are going to get more people to look at them. They're doing it because actually creating through the media form is something which is important to their practice and which tells them something different about how archaeology as a whole might operate. So, two sort of comments which come up continuously throughout these archaeologists' work is that using different media in different ways provides new ways to think about the past. And using reflexive and creative practice methodology is a way to actually afford this, or a way to actually engage with this. But there is still a bit of an elephant in the room, the post-processual elephant. And post-processualism has been a bit of an issue for archaeologists for some time, in that it's a really great theoretical framework, and there's been some really great applications of it, but physical methodologies and physical renderings of it have been a little bit difficult. So for those not familiar, post-processualism kind of talks about the idea that we all talk through this sort of subjective lens, and that there's the ability for different interpretations for multilinearity, multivocality, that audiences can have agency, and obviously when you then sort of shove this back onto a set of text, you can describe it, and you can note it, but you can't necessarily natively demonstrate this to people or get people to engage with it in different ways. So obviously the issue is that a lot of the media forms we use in archaeology have internal affordances which don't necessarily permit the external affordances that we, or the external structures that we require to express a lot of our theoretical frameworks effectively. So the reason why video games are pretty good at overcoming this problem, and why they might actually be good at fixing the issue of post-processualism, is something which actually the Evolving Space Planet Games, I can't remember the name of, I'm so sorry, covered off, which is that games as simulations, they're really good for interpolating between data, interpretation, and outcome, and this actually makes them really good for most archaeological theoretical frameworks. But more specifically, they're interactive, which means they can subvert these traditional forms of knowledge creation and structures, and that you can give the player agency, which creates different ways that you can structure a relationship between creator, content, and consumer. Games can also be non-linear, which basically is post-processualism in a nutshell. You have these great opportunities for multilinearity and multiplicity. So, as part of my MSc research, which I looked at basically 156 interviews across game development studios, ranging from AAA to independent, everything in between, as well as doing these placements with studios. So basically, especially the independent end of the scale, a lot of the developers were talking about how, well, they're dealing with historic games. I should probably state that first. Developers who were working with historic games talked about how their creative practice was actually like a dialogue with the past, that through creating, they were challenged to think about the content they're trying to create differently. Now, this didn't hold true in all situations, but a lot of people really expressed this thing that the actual physical creative practice was challenging how they could think about the past, and that seemed pretty relevant to archaeology, and maybe that was something we could take up. So basically, I took the idea and ran with it, ignoring my own advice to myself that copy and paste is not a good design architecture. Following on from this, the interviews which I went across the archaeologists as well as the developers showed that archaeologists as a whole tend not to be really great game developers to start off with. We're not trained to do it. And at the same stage, game developers tend not to be very good archaeologists. Again, they're not trained to do that. So what kind of sits in the middle? And this is something which Jeff raised in his presentation, which is we need these crossover people who operate between both sides. So another thing which sort of showed up is that developers actually struggle to speak to archaeologists, and archaeologists don't know how to approach designers necessarily, which is something which Andrew has mentioned in his talk as well. So these crossover people become integral to how we can operate. And part of the way of becoming a crossover person is rather than just talking, is to actually co-create, to do stuff with people. So I sort of thought to myself, why not do both? Why not take this media form, which has the potential to solve a lot of, or potential to maybe solve a lot of our problems with archaeological theory and method, with regards to especially post-processualism, take these issues that we've identified with archaeologists not necessarily being great game developers not necessarily being good archaeologists, and sort of smashes all together. So yesterday, Meta talked about how we can develop games for a bunch of reasons. For commercial purposes, to explore the potential to generate money, as a way to explore a topic, and as a way to create new skills. Now, my research kind of fits into the second and third of these sort of topic areas. So to kind of rewind and summarize a little bit before we progress on. Media can influence our ideas, the way that we think about something. Reflexive experimentation into archaeology has given some interesting results so far. Post-processualism and the kind of interpretive archaeological cohort are still an issue to put into practice with some things, and video games have the potential, hopefully, to aid some of these things. Game developers corroborate the potential of the form for thinking about the past in new and exciting ways, and working together turns out to be a pretty good way to go about overcoming the gap and the need for people to sort of co-create and co-develop. So yesterday, sort of, Eric asked the question. That's the wrong one. Yesterday, Eric asked the question of how archaeology could use game mechanics, and this is very core to what I'm doing. So as part of my PhD, I'm creating 10 case studies to think about archaeology. 2 of these are going to be created physically in the field as I'm excavating, as a way to kind of challenge our traditional excavation practices. 2 of them are created in the laboratory as part of the sort of like post-processing. 2 are created in the post-processing where we're delivering the results, and 4 of them are kind of created as in when things come up that are interesting to us. On top of that, I'm also dabbling with creating my own engine, because one of the things already that I've discovered, different engines have different parameters, different languages have different parameters, which influence how you can interact and engage in the past. So developing my own engine is a way to overcome some of the issues inherent with these other engines, as well as to actually think through how archaeology might want to structure itself in the game space. So it's kind of like a summary point to what I'm trying to do in my PhD. I'm trying to see how the act of creating a game and reflexively thinking about my own practice within that can help us challenge our interpretive and thinking process about archaeology as much as our methodological ones. So as part of this kind of record, I'm completely recording everything that I do as part of this practice, including like video cameras, everything on the screen, all the conversations that I have with my co-developers. And there's obviously some disparity between the useful and the non-useful comments, as you've been seeing through some of the code comments that have come up. So some of them include, I should please stop using my Wacom, which is like a drawing tablet. As an editor, I tend to chair dance a lot during my creative practice. But some of them are actually incredibly valuable. And this process of actually studying ourselves' work through different mediums turns out to be a really interesting way to think about not only how we engage with archaeology, but how we engage with media as well. So far I've made 3 of these case studies, which have been a super interesting process, and I will tentatively say, yes, thinking in terms of game design and development provides a really interesting and new way to think about the past. It provides a different way to approach interpretation, as well as communication, which is how we generally tend to frame archaeogaming. Learning how to think in terms of game design takes time and effort and skill until we kind of teach game design like we teach academic writing. It probably won't remain an accessible way for most people to approach archaeology. My experiment with writing games in the field kind of demonstrates this. It's quite difficult. As part of this, reflexivity is hugely important. It's about the process and not the destination. So whilst creating games as a means to an end is obviously very valuable, and a lot of our system would fall apart without it, also thinking about why we're making them this way, what it offers us for archaeology, what the programming languages, what the structures, the engines allow us to do, which is not available in other formats, is probably the most important part of this. As part of the modding talk earlier, it sort of demonstrated there's a surprising amount of us out there who are working to create mods in the last few years, and people like Josh Unsworth and Sean Graham are also starting to create games within this sort of critical framework. And I think this is going to be important, creating this community where we're not only thinking about making games for a purpose, but what the practice of making games is. So, yesterday Eric also said that we can learn a lot about badly made archaeology games. And this is a little bit true for some of mine, but hopefully I'll also produce some good ones as well. But analysing why they're bad, why they're good, what the practice was, is going to be the important part of this journey. So yesterday we also talked about what genre our research would be, and jokingly I kind of said that mine would probably be a horror story, but realistically I think it would probably also be a comedy and hopefully not a tragedy. Next year I'll be back with more of the results of this work, a more sort of comprehensive analysis of how creative practice in certain fields actually operates. But for now, if you have any questions or ideas or comments about my master's, my PhD, my terrible Twitter bot, which creates generally quite bad archaeogaming ideas, then please give me a question and grill me, or we can get a beer about it. So that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Please, questions for Carla.
Just a comment, I'm glad to see it's not only computer scientists who are thinking comments like that.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My question is more about something else you're doing. You recently started also publishing videos on YouTube.
Oh yes, yeah.
So I was about gaming and giving your archaeological perspective, and how is it working? Do you have feedback? People are curious about something specific. What's the relationship with the public? I mean, your experience basically.
Yeah, okay, so this actually is it ties really well in actually to what I'm doing as part of the PhD, where the act of playing a game, if you think about it reflexively and kind of like in terms of both an archaeological lens and a game development lens, you sort of start to understand how these things operate. So part of the Let's Play series that I'm doing on the Banner Saga is focusing about not only how the developers, who I talked to a little bit, doing the game and how they made the game and what they were going for, but how us as archaeologists can interpret that. So the experience of playing the game becomes integral to how we can kind of understand and communicate that. And part of the really fun part of it is when you get comments from other people and feedback from people who are not only archaeologists, maybe game designers, maybe people who are just part of the public or players themselves. And they often come up with questions which are really far left of field to what we would expect, and they want to know a lot of different things about the past and about game development and how they might intersect. So, yes.
I really want to read your PhD when it comes out, which you very rarely say about PhDs, I find. And every time I've seen you speak, you tend to do something creative. Are you going to do that with your plans for publishing the PhD?
My PhD is, so the PhD contains a ton of media, as well as these 10 case studies, but it's held within a game framework. So the PhD itself will be played, not just written in text. Because obviously you run into that problem that when you want to, it's easier to show someone something than to tell them it. So if I want to talk about a mechanic and the different forms of mechanics, the different way that we can engage with these, it's so much better to just say, here's the game, play it, experience it, rather than here's 100,000 words.
Thank you. Just a basic question. What's your primary background? Is it game design or programming, or is it archaeology? Or
kind of a horrible mismatch of everything. I had virtually no game design background until I started my master's, at which point I had a lot of friends who were game designers and I became really interested in it. But my primary background is in archaeology and computer science.
We have a question from the chat. What do you think about archaeologists still seeing archaeologists just as a shovel in bucket discipline and games designer just as a joypad for martial entertainment?
I completely missed that, sorry, I was busy. Yes, I was flopping.
What do you think about archaeologists still seeing archaeology just as a shovel and bucket discipline and games designers just as a joypad or martial entertainment?
Could you rephrase that? I'm so sorry.
I see that the view of archaeologists towards archaeology, we see more of a hands-on discipline, very focused on archaeology as such, and games designers just seen as archaeology as only a setting or a framework and not going in depth.
So this is the PhD question, which is that, and something that Eric also said was, can games, or game mechanics specifically, be useful to archaeology? And something that this tries to overcome is this question between games just using archaeology as set dressing or as kind of like set pieces, and you kind of just produce a series of facts which are put into a game to give it flavor, rather than necessarily revealing the mechanics of archaeology through games, or using games as a way to supplement or provide new mechanics or new ways of approaching archaeology. I hope that answered that.
One question from the chat. How is your PhD going to be marked in the QK Danish marking framework? And is it even possible to submit a game for marking?
Yes, well, this is something which my supervisors have gone backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards on, and it eventually comes down to who your marking or who your committee are going to be. And I've been lucky enough that because I'm working between both Aarhus and York and through the CDH, which is Centre for Digital Heritage, they've come up and basically allowed me to create in this way, because they saw that basically forcing it back into a conventional method was not going to do the topic so much justice. So it's been a lengthy dialogue, and it's still going to be ongoing right up until the end, but it's definitely possible. And there's also a conference coming up quite soon at the British Library, which is looking at how we can start to publish new types of dissertations, new types of knowledge formation through games, through movies, through other sort of ways, so how we can produce different dissertations in different ways rather than just text. Yes.
Maybe could you tell us a few things about the archaeogaming bot?
What was that, sorry?
About the archaeogaming bot.
Oh god. So the archaeogaming bot was this idea that we tend to see the same games, the same mechanics, the same interaction methods brought up time and time and time again. And the archaeogaming bot basically operates on two levels. It trawls through a bunch of blogs and a bunch of tweets about what people think mechanics and ideas about archaeogaming could be, very hypothetically. And it also uses a secondary system which people can actually input varying different things about how they want interaction in games about the past to look. And then it basically chooses up and spits out these various different ideas, ranging from the very conventional and very good to the completely obscene, like having to use a Dreamcast fishing rod to operate a pottery refitting game in a post-processual world. So there's, you can definitely check it out. It's at Archaeogaming Idea Bot, I believe. And you can also submit to it as well if you want to have really great ideas about different types of games you want to see. I might end up making some of them if you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.